title of this lesson is English Settlement in the New World. Please refer to Canvas for relevant text references for this lesson. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain the English motivation to colonize the Americas beginning in the 1500s. You will also be able to compare the initial colonization of Jamestown and the Chesapeake colonies with the New England colonies. You will be able to trace the development and origins of African-based slavery in British America, and you will also be able to define the terms Puritan sense of mission and American exceptionalism. Let's begin. England felt compelled to join the race to establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and by the late 1500s, competition among European countries for the economic dominance that American colonization promised was in full force. For most of the 1500s, the distinction of most dominant country fell to Spain, in no small part because of its formidable navy, the Spanish Armada. Patrolling the waters of the Atlantic in their formidable galleon ships, the Armada posed a threat to any and all would-be competitors. Their dominance, however, would be challenged beginning in the 1580s by a ragtag band of English merchant ships known as the Sea Dogs. The Sea Dogs were led by Sir Francis Drake, a man rumored to have very close ties with the reigning English monarch of the time, Queen Elizabeth. The Sea Dogs routinely engaged in piracy of Spanish ships on the open waters of the Atlantic. This behavior outraged the Spanish monarch of the time, King Philip II. The piracy of the Sea Dogs, along with other political issues Philip held against his former sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, motivated him to order an attack of England. Despite having mounted what your text referred to as the greatest invasion fleet in history, the English were able to repel the Spanish invasion because their smaller, lighter ships were far more adroit for use off the English coast. The English defeat of the Armada opened the waterways up to greater and freer exploration of the Americas without fear of having to face the threat the Armada once posed. After making initial forays into English colonization with the failed Roanoke experience, discussed at the end of Chapter 1 of your text, the English crown continued to lend its support to establish a profitable colonial venture for its benefit in the Americas. By 1606, Queen Elizabeth I had been succeeded by King James I. Incidentally, this is the same monarch for whom the English translation of the Bible is named. As England's reigning monarch, King James would issue a royal charter sanctioning English exploration efforts with an eye toward making a lot of money. While the first group of men to respond to the King's charter was a group of investors who started the Virginia Company, the capital they raised would help to fund the expedition out of which the Jamestown colony would be established in 1607. Note that this would be 42 years after the Spanish established St. Augustine. The early stages of the Jamestown settlement featured repeated conflicts between the estimated 20,000 Algonquin and Powhatan peoples who populated the area. The winter of 1609 and 1610 was a particularly brutal winter, and during this period, known as the Starving Time, scores of settlers would succumb to overexposure to the elements, starvation, and disease. An eventual defeat of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy in the spring of 1614 would be one of two major turning points in the fortunes of the Jamestown colony early on. The second turning point would come in the form of the discovery of a marketable commodity which came by way of the tobacco plant. The Englishman John Rolfe was the first to realize the commercial potential of tobacco, which had been introduced to him and his fellow Englishmen by the natives they encountered. Rolfe would then invest in the cultivation of this plant in huge quantities, thus making it the first cash crop to come to the Chesapeake colonies. A cash crop is a single crop grown in huge quantities for a commercial market. Soon, other cash crops would follow, most notably indigo, rice, and later cotton. The development of these cash crops held in common the need for an extensive labor force. The earliest settlers of the Jamestown and other surrounding colonies thought of themselves as members of the gentleman's class, for which agricultural labor was beneath their stations. Since they couldn't conceive of actually putting in the labor to cultivate the crops from which they sought to make their profits from, they needed to employ other solutions to address their labor needs. The very first attempt these planters turned to in addressing their labor problem was the enslavement of Native Americans. But this proved to be a workable solution, or rather an unworkable solution, because natives knew the area too well and therefore posed a high flight risk to their would-be owners. So indentured servitude was tried next. The indentured servitude labor system reflected the early colonist preference for semi-free white labor and initially consisted primarily of Irish workers. In exchange for passage to America and a promise of 7 years' worth of labor as spelled out in the labor contract known as an indenture, servants would contract their services on North American farms. Though initially better for the colonists than Native American enslavement had been, in time, the indenture system would be problematic too. These problems were highlighted in force with 1676's Bacon Rebellion, an uprising that pitted poor landless white laborers, Native Americans, and even some of African descent against the landed aristocracy of colonial Virginia. This illustration shows the burning of Jamestown during Bacon's Rebellion of 1776. The biracial cooperation between landless blacks and whites sufficiently alarmed the ruling status quo enough to the point to where the racial caste system was hardened in its aftermath. Some historians would argue that Bacon's Rebellion went a long way in establishing what would be in time the most durable solution to the labor problem in colonial Virginia, remaining a solution to labor woes in America for a long time to come. The system I am referring to, of course, is race-based African chattel slavery. To be sure, the English would not be unique in practicing slavery. Ancient civilizations, including those in Western Africa, where the majority of those eventually enslaved hailed from, engaged in the practice as well. What made the English brand of it as utilized on American soil unique was its commercial dimension. And so it would be that in 1619 a Dutch slave ship bearing 20 individuals deposited their human cargo on Jamestown's shores. Early evidence seems to suggest that these earliest Africans were treated more like indentured servants. But the condition of those that followed them in subsequent decades came to be more and more defined and hardened as the 1600s wore on. As the 1600s wore on, controls to regulate the black labor force grew more and more elaborate. Color line distinctions in the law began to appear for the first time in 1662 when Virginia's colonial legislature determined that any child born in the colony would be held in bond or free status according to the condition of the mother. Now, why would this otherwise patrilineal society base a black child's legal condition off of the condition of the mother and not the father, as you might otherwise expect? Well, this early law proved significant for a couple of reasons. First, it made the condition of slavery synonymous with being black. Second, it made slavery a lifelong condition not just for adults, but for children too. And, as has already been pointed out earlier in the lesson, Bacon's rebellion hastened this phenomena. Eminent historian Ira Berlin, in a book on colonial slavery entitled Many Thousands Gone, argued that by the year 1690, British America had gone from being a society with slaves to a slave society. What do you all think he meant by that statement? And based on what you will read and later review in other parts of this lesson, do you agree with his assessment? In terms of how those from Africa made their journey to America, we will take a closer look at the phenomena known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the name given to the journey made by those who had been taken from their native homelands in Africa to travel to the Western Hemisphere to ultimately become enslaved. Its name refers to the fact that the slave trade was at the center of a system of trading routes that crisscrossed the Atlantic and connected Europe, the Americas, and Africa. These routes, known as the Triangle Trade, made some Europeans very wealthy. The next slide shows a typical trade route exchange. If you connected the 3 points involved in this exchange, you will notice that they form a triangle, hence the name Triangle Trade Route. Note what commodities each area contributed to this commercial enterprise as shown in this map. Depending on the orientation of the captains of these slave ships, determined whether these ships would be loosely packed or tightly packed. Most slave ship captains were tight packers. Tight packers carried huge quantities of enslaved people because the more that could be transported at once, the higher the profit margin one could expect to enjoy. Tight packers, with their vast cargoes, often forced their enslaved cargo to lie in spaces smaller than the standard grades in spoon-like fashion on top of each other, as pictured on the next slide. 'T. The illustrations on this slide show the implements that were used to bind the men, women, and children taken on board these ships and how they were restrained during their journey. Aside from brief respites during the day, those shackled by these restraints remained confined by them for 6 to 8 weeks, the length of a typical transatlantic voyage. As far as conditions on board the ships are concerned, the extreme overcrowding, inadequate ventilation, and non-hygienic environments made the hulls of these ships ripe breeding grounds for diseases of various kinds. There are also a myriad of dietary-related illnesses brought on by the poor or limited amount of foods that had any nutritional value. Large crews were generally employed, since large numbers were needed to maintain orders on these ships. Members of the crews tended to come from Europe's lower classes, and many were even members of debtor colonies, where working on board these ships was used as a way to retire the debts that they had been imprisoned for. The kinds of men who staffed these crews usually came from Europe's lower classes. Daily meals consisted of gruel, mashed mush made from hearty grains, and there were periodic bouts of exercise. This was permitted to prevent muscle atrophication and generally consisted of jumping up and down and stretching. Sometimes women were forced to dance with crew members, and they were particularly vulnerable to unwanted sexual advances and attacks by the crew members. Those who refused or offered any kind of resistance were beaten or deprived of provisions. The closer to landfall these ships got, the quantity of the food and the length of time allowed for exercise changed. Scars that came from shackles and beatings were greased with tar, and palm oil was applied to the skin to help it achieve a healthy veneer. This was all in hopes of landing higher profits for the captains. Shifting our focus northward now, we find that the motives guiding the colonization of New England colonies were different than the motives behind the establishment of the Chesapeake colonies. For Jamestown and the rest of Virginia, the initial motive seemed to be powered by a desire for profit. For the next set of colonies this lesson examines, it appears that religious motives were key. In order to achieve a greater understanding of this, a little background is necessary. Frustrated over policies and disagreement over Catholic dogma, specifically as it related to divorce, King Henry VIII, shown here, one of England's reigning monarchs in the 1500s, established the Anglican Church, which was also known as the Church of England. To the untrained eye, there appeared to be little difference between the worship practices of the Anglican faith and the Catholic Church. This was a point of contention among some members of the Church of England, who'd felt that not enough separation had been achieved between the two denominations, and that the Anglican Church was not enough of a reflection of pure Protestantism as preached by German cleric Martin Luther. These three sects were those that would go on to become future Presbyterians, so-called non-separating Congregationalists, and the most radical of the three groups, the Separatists, who were also known as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims believed that the Anglican Church was beyond redemption. Since it was the official Church of England, their views made them very unpopular with the crown. They were given an option to leave England and resettle in the Netherlands, a country with an established reputation for religious tolerance by the early 1600s. Dutch relocation proved to be an unsuitable solution for this group, who by now had adopted the name Pilgrims. Because they believed their children were beginning to favor Dutch culture over their own English culture. By 1620, they sought and received permission to establish a colony in America, and it is a venture that started in September of 1620. About 102 passengers and 30 crew members set sail for Virginia in September of 1620. But they were blown off of their original course, landing off the tip of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in November of that year. The colony that was established here came to be known as Plymouth, after a community in England where many of them hailed from. A rather harsh winter awaited them, landing as they did in late autumn. And it was only through strategic alliances they forged with area natives that those who did survive were able to stave off starvation. The journey taken by these pilgrims is especially noteworthy, not just for where they landed, but for what they did before they even set foot on American soil. While still on board the vessel pictured here, the Mayflower, passengers drafted and agreed to what is considered to be the first written constitution in British America, the Mayflower Compact. The less radical sect of the religious dissenters to the Church of England, the non-separating Congregationalists, wished also to establish an American colony where they were free to practice their religious convictions. This group, known as the Puritans, since they wished only to purify the Church of England initially and not to break away from it totally, established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, selecting John Winthrop to be its first governor. A pious man, Winthrop expressed belief and penned the hopes of allegiance to a targeted goal before landing in America. This sense of mission lay at the heart of a model of Christian charity, a document Winthrop wrote in which he encouraged his fellow colonists to take seriously the work of establishing a model Christian society that other countries could follow. The idea that their American experience should be a shining example for other countries to follow, and that failure to achieve this would spell doom, could be considered an example of a Jeremiad. Taken from the name of Jeremiah, who was a biblical prophet said to have been so distraught over ancient Israel's spiritual depravity that he wept over it, a Jeremiad is a speech or a written work expressing a bitter lament or a prophecy of doom. Winthrop emphasized the importance of all working hard to achieve the goal of being a model society, lest calamity befall them. This drive to be the example for all the world to follow has been a powerful theme throughout American history. It so happens that here, the goal was to be a shining religious example, but it can be argued that the same drive to be a model for others to follow religiously has morphed to become the drive to be a model for others to follow economically and politically in our own day and time. It's also at the basis of what we think about when we think about the term American exceptionalism. The fact that America is an exceptional place, especially blessed by God, and that it has been this way from the beginning. What do you all think about that? Arguably, buy-in for the mission and the compulsion placed on the colonists to work hard as spelled out in its earliest laws led to the establishment of a thriving colony from the start. A sound agrarian economy was established, though it was not one based on cash crop agriculture, as was the case further south. The Puritans placed a high value on education by virtue of the fact that one of the first printing presses and colleges were founded within the first decade of the colony's establishment. When it was started in 1636 as an institution to train ministers, Harvard College became the first institution of higher learning established on American soil. The village was the center of Puritan life, and its layout encouraged communal intellectual exchanges. The Puritans frowned upon showy displays of wealth, but liked to reward those they found particularly industrious. For that reason, land grants were distributed according not just to the size of the family, but was also based on what colony fathers' beliefs were about the industry of the head of the household to make the best and most productive use of that land. It can be argued that this was perhaps the first example of an American merit-based system that could be found in colonial America. Women played a vital role in the establishment of the colony early on. It was believed that women played a crucial role in the transmission of spiritual values to the children, and so efforts to educate girls were surprisingly enlightened given the times. There'll be more said about the status of women in colonial America in a future lesson. The Puritanical view of their adopted homeland was laden with religious imagery. The Puritans saw themselves as the Hebrews of their times, a people who, because they'd been persecuted, had to seek refuge in a promised land. To them, America represented that promised land, and their voyage to it was compared to the 40-year journey that the Hebrews took to reach their promised land in the book of Exodus. This use of religious imagery helped to more solidly define that sense of mission or purpose to be a success, to be that shining example. In the quest for perfection, there could be no room for dissension. Everyone must be on the same page, and everyone must agree. In such a society, there's little difference between spiritual or religious laws and secular or non-religious laws. In this sense, it could be argued that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a theocracy. And what exactly is a theocracy? Well, a theocracy is a society in which there really is no difference between religious law and secular law. And in fact, religious law defines secular society. Despite the best efforts of Puritan leadership in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was dissension. Dissension came in the form of a woman, well, at least some of it did. Anne Hutchinson was an outspoken, very pious, highly religious, well-regarded member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony who disagreed with some of the religious teachings of the colony leaders. She disagreed, for example, that there was no salvation in grace. She also rebelled against the puritanical view of womanhood. One of the ways in which she did this was to conduct Bible studies in her home that featured in attendance both men and women. And this was strictly against the teaching of Puritan ideology that believed that women did not have the right to teach men religious matters, especially in mixed company. Another dissenter was in the form of Roger Williams. Roger Williams was banished from the colony because of his dissenting views that included such opinions and beliefs as it not being necessary to mandate church attendance, and that church attendance should be something that is done on the free will of an individual, that we should not be compelled to attend worship services, as was the case in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. For his views, Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And one of the first things that he did in establishing a colony of his own out of that banishment, the colony of Rhode Island, was to, in its constitution, include a plank that separated religious institutions from the affairs of government. In other words, separation of church and state. One of the first residents that Roger Williams would welcome into the new colony of Rhode Island would be none other than Anne Hutchinson.
This concludes this lesson. Please check Canvas for relevant text references.